All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Jonathan Late. I'm the Planning Director. Thank you all for joining us again in another installment of our working group sessions. Before we begin, Robin, would you mind taking roll?
Alexander Liu.
Here.
Angela Delaporta.
Here.
Doria Suma. Gail Price. Heather Rosen. Keith Reckdahl. Kirsten Flynn.
Here.
Lakiba Pittman. Len Smith. C.E. Zhang. Terry Holzmer. Tim Still. Waldick Kazmarski. Yunin Song. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Robin. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Waldeck Kazmarski to the group. Thank you for joining us, and appreciate that you were one of the alternates, and now you have a seat at the table, which was what you've been wanting all along. Congratulations. Okay, so we have our agenda. One of the first things we're going to do here is have an opportunity for public input, and we've heard comments from at the town hall meeting, and I think at other working group meetings, where there was an interest to have some public comment periods before the meeting and at the end of the meeting. And so what we have planned at this point is to offer, there's a 15-minute window that we have at the outset of our meeting where we can receive public comments. And after that point, if there's additional public comments that we want to be expressed, we will have that at the end of the meeting so that we can take care of the business that we're here to do. After the end of the public comment period, we're going to take a slight detour on our regularly scheduled agenda to allow an opportunity for a discussion about a debrief on the town hall meeting. We received some emails from some of the working group members who wanted to talk about subcommittees and what was the other thing? There was other related matters in terms of maybe the process and how we're approaching this. And so we'll spend about another 15 minutes on that before we dive into some of probably the thing that you've all been waiting for, as I understand it. I mean, we're ready to really get, into this. So with that, Robin, would you mind calling the first speaker?
Ken Joy.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to all members of the working group, staff, and consultants for hearing public comments. I would like to start by saying it's been difficult for residents of the neighborhood to know what to expect from the group. In particular, I've posed a number of questions to the group, and only a very small number of them have been addressed either in discussions with this body or have been answered by staff or consultants. So I'd like to ask, wherever possible, that resident questions be addressed. One very important one, I think, at the top of my list, is the fact that in the grant proposal for this project, there's specific mention of 395 Page Mill Road, which is commonly referred to as the Cloudera parcel. I don't know why the owner of that parcel is not considered a stakeholder, and I don't know why this group is not discussing that parcel more. Also, in that grant funding proposal, it said that there were going to be quarterly updates to VTA and MTC. Are those being posted to the project website? Where can one see the quarterly updates that are being given to the grant tours? In the slide deck for today's meeting, there's a discussion about a ban left turns onto Ash from Pepper Olive prevents neighborhood intrusion and cut-through traffic. But I'm questioning whether that would have the unintended consequence of adding motorist traffic turning left onto Park Boulevard, which of course is a designated bike boulevard, and any impact to that should be mitigated. I think that this proposal needs to be examined very carefully. The existing conditions section of Staff Report 9921 described transportation choices of employees of businesses located in the study area in addition to residents. Is there any TDM data showing how existing employees at Cloudera, Playground, Global, et cetera, commute to work? And I noted that it said drive-alone mode share for study area residents, 52%, is lower than that for Palo Alto as a whole, 71%. So I'd like to ask, is the same true for employees of businesses in the study area? It would appear to me that the new crossing being discussed for Ash and Pageville does not meet the VTA standard for across barrier connections. And I wonder if continued reference to this crossing has to do with the continued references to Sarah Wallace Park. And there are a number of things in the Perkins and Will contract that I had posed questions about, one of which was whether there are going to be GIS maps with layers of information available from the Nvcap website. I haven't seen that yet. If it's posted there, please let us know where to find that. Thank you very much.
Todd Collins.
Hi, I'm Todd Collins. I'm a member of the Palo Alto School Board, though not speaking as a representative of the board today. As I'm sure most of you remember, I came to the last meeting and asked that the schools be given a role in this process, since I think schools are, in many ways, the ultimate community amenity, and it's hard to discuss building a new neighborhood without, or rebuilding a neighborhood without discussing the role of schools in that neighborhood. We've been asking since literally before this process started for a seat at this table and have not been granted one. So, and that's not me asking, that is the school district formally asking, and we've been told no. So I hope you guys will discuss that among yourselves and with the city leadership, because we would very much like to participate in the process. We did meet, myself and our chief business officer, Mr. Jim Novak, met with Mr. Lay and Ms. Lee, who are working on their computers. And had a good discussion about some of the issues facing the group and some of the considerations regarding schools, so that was good. That was about 2 weeks ago. We continue to wish, I mean, that certainly alerted us to some of the complex issues with school siting and the difficulty of working with a 60-acre parcel and all the different landholders, which made it even more important for us to be involved in this, because it's clearly going to be an iterative process where different permutations are going to have to work through and different options look like in terms of housing and commercial and where things go and how access routes work, and all of which gets right to the heart of school attendance areas. And, you know, we're in a mode where the city is growing. This is a part of the growth, a big part of the growth. And if we don't plan for school sites as we plan for neighborhood growth, we will not have school sites in our neighborhoods. If school sites are an afterthought, there will be no room for them. And kids will be crossing El Camino and Page Mill and Alma to get to school, or taking cars to get to school because there are no safe route options other than cars, unless we do something to preserve neighborhood schools, which has been our core foundation as a stated value of the Palo Alto School Board for 50 years. So I hope that I urge you, those of you who care about the schools, and I know many of you have been involved in the schools, Gail Price, former school board member, Terry, they're going to retire the Substitute of the Year medal one of these years. I know many of you care about the schools and are engaged with the schools, and I hope you speak up for the schools, because we really need to be a part of this process. Thank you.
Karen Holman.
Good evening, and thank you for letting members of the public speak at the earlier end of this process. It's much appreciated. So a couple of things that I've not noticed. I haven't done an extensive review of all the materials, but I'm pretty darn familiar with the materials, and I have not seen an economic analysis. And I think that's really important. There seem to be some assumptions made based on comments made by various members of the public or working group members, and there really needs to be a professional economic analysis that's performed. That was, SOFA is often mentioned, that was done for SOFA, it's done for comprehensive plan programs. This is a coordinated area plan. I think it's highly appropriate for that. The zoning on the site, because I mention this because I've heard a question come up, I think several times in at working group meetings, is like, well, what's the basis from which the working group is founding their recommendations? The zoning on the property is RM30, and if this runs the same way as SOFA and as any other thing that I have been a participant in or observed, that RM30 is the baseline zoning, and so anything that's granted above that is a part of a give and take. Somebody has mentioned, I don't remember who, I'm sorry for that, have talked about negotiations. Yeah, if you want to do some horse trading, a coordinated area plan, you can do that, but it's a give and take. There are no assumed rights beyond an RM30. I don't know what staff's approach to that has been, but that's my experience and what seems appropriate. Going a little bit on with that, that same sort of scenario, there's a lot of redevelopment. It's been a great frustration of mine. A lot of redevelopment's going on while this process is ongoing. And during the SOFA plan, all development and redevelopment stopped, because otherwise it's a moving target. You don't know what your baseline is. You don't know what you're working with, and you don't know what is there to build upon. So let's stop moving the target. Appreciate the historic analysis for the Fry's building and the office building. I would encourage the consultants, Page and Turnbull, to also do interviews. It wouldn't take that long. There are local residents who are descendants of the family that started the cannery there. And one of the things that gets a little bit short shrift, I think, in the analysis is, and one of the criteria for historic evaluation is uniqueness of architecture. And this is certainly a unique building. The Fry's building in particular is a unique building, not only in Palo Alto, but in a larger geographic area as well. And along with that, it's also an important opportunity to celebrate our Chinese culture. It's an important opportunity to celebrate our Chinese history, our Chinese culture. And the owner of the cannery was such a successful businessman. He was the richest, or wealthiest, is probably a more tasteful word, wealthiest Chinese person in, I believe, the country, maybe in the state, but I think in the country when he passed away. I don't know what, and to make that, put that into some kind of context, I would try to compare that to, like, who now would that person compare to? Would that person be compared to Arriaga or who? I mean, let's really recognize and appreciate what the value is and importance is of the cannery and its operators and the people who founded the cannery there. The other thing that I think is important along with the Fry's site, and then just two other points quickly, with the Fry's site is, I think, to understand what's possible with the Fry's building, it's important to have some kind of provision of information of what the square footage is, what the heights are. With a building like that, you have to look at what could happen in that building in terms of adaptive reuse. Because just to look at it as a building that has an X FAR or an X square footage isn't really informative to most people. There's one architect, two architects, Gail, on the group, but it doesn't really foster creative ideas of what things could be used for. I've mentioned before in comments here that, especially up in Marin, the industrial buildings are regaled. They're regaled and featured and enhanced. And there was one other thing. Oh, yeah. Something else I have not seen provided, and apologies if it has, is a list of potential funding sources. So, for instance, for renaturalization of the creek, there are potential funding sources for that. There are potential funding sources for any number of things. And I think to understand what's feasible and what isn't, so things aren't just, ideas aren't just cast aside as, well, we'd never be able to afford that. We can't ask the property owner for that. Let's get on the table what the potential funding sources are for different ideas. Thank you.
Mark Molyneux.
Hi there. My name is Mark Molyneux. I've lived around this area for 11 years now, but just this month, I just moved into Palo Alto. I'm now renting on Seal Street. $1,500 gets you 86 square feet, give or take. But I guess that's a trade-off a lot of people are willing to take. You know, it's when you have smaller units, things become relatively more affordable. It's not like it's very affordable. And I think that's something that Palo Alto needs to address, is there is a need for actually affordable housing. And the question is Palo Alto delivering it? And what could Palo Alto do to make sure it's doing well? And I think if you look at what are the implicit costs that go into making buildings and units, part of this is land costs, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that at a point like this, but there are also implicit costs that go in. The bigger you make it, the more expensive it's going to be per square foot. One very important implicit cost is parking costs. When you require parking on site, this really corresponds directly to being more expensive for people who live there down the line. And it's very easy to say, oh yeah, this is just mandated, it'll work, we need to keep cars off the streets. And you're not wrong. Congestion is a very real issue. You can't just say, let people park everywhere, don't put on-site parking. But Palo Alto holistically needs to address this and needs to actually say, street parking, as places densify, it's the tragedy of the commons. The more people we have, the less street parking there's for everyone else, and Palo Alto just needs to deal with this. And the answer is not to require parking on site. This just passes the expense to the renter and any other and owner-occupiers for that matter. So I would say that there are a lot of people. I lived for 7 years in this area without a car. If you don't make parking convenient, if you don't make it required, people will find ways to get around without a car. I did for many, many years. And if it became inconvenient, I would do it again. This area is, in a lot of ways, you can get around without a car. And it is our job, I think, to make this possible for people. So I'd say for this unit, for these units here, I really would like to see ideas of not kind of going with maybe outdated modes of how to require parking and to look at how to make things more affordable by trying to actually get better results. Thank you.
The last speaker is Cedric de la Bourgidere.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon. So also to echo what Ken said, Park Boulevard is a really important bicycle route. There's already a lot of traffic that's happening on that road that's not being addressed properly by the city. So we really need to not make that worse. So I agree that if you only deal with the cut-through traffic on Ash, Pepper, and Olive, that will drive traffic towards Park. I think if you do those things, you definitely need to put the right turn lane on El Camino onto Page Mill. That's been something I've been calling for a number of years now. If you watch the traffic patterns, you can see that the reason there's a lot of cut-through traffic is because there's straight-through people driving stopped at that rightmost lane. Also, I agree the crossing of Page Mill is unnecessary, and such efforts and funds we better apply to crossing the train and Alma at Matadero Creek. Such a crossing is on the city's bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan. In regards to office and housing space, I did some research. It looks like 120 square feet is about the minimum that you get for office per person. Some people might say 80 square feet, but I'm not sure that it really takes into account things like common space. So it also looks like the minimum housing is about 300 square feet per person in sort of super economy mode. So roughly what that comes out to is however much square footage you have of office, you need about 3 times as much square footage of housing if you're not going to make the jobs housing imbalance worse. And then if you want to include open space for that housing, I think that's a good thing, and that would increase the ratio. On that score, I would say I didn't notice in your comments, summary of comments, missing from that summary is call for rooftop gardens accessible to residents of that space. I think open space is important. Private open space is important to personal well-being. On the question of the creek, I think widening and naturalizing the creek is by far the superior option. The kind of usable edge that's up above might be nice for strollers, but it doesn't really help the ecosystem. Currently, we have a problem that the native frogs can't really get down through the concrete channels down into the creek to breed. And so we've seen a steep decline of our amphibian populations in the city over the course of the past decade. So this is an opportunity to widen that channel into what's currently the Fry's parking lot, make that into a park, and make it into a natural habitat area. Finally, I would say that I would encourage you to look at underground parking and podium parking, not waste surface area on parking of cars. If you dig down into the soil, you might be digging up some contaminated soil, so that is an opportunity to clean that soil. I would hope that the city would look at cleaning the soil as opposed to just shipping it off or sealing it in. Thank you very much.
Okay, any other speakers? Okay. Okay, well, thank you. For the public comments, I was just talking to Elena about possibly looking at how we can respond to those in a forum where the speakers get some kind of a response, and we'll explore whether or not we can sort of identify those questions on the website and then give a staff response to them so that people can at least see that there's been some acknowledgement and effort to respond to those questions. And of course, staff is available after the meetings and between the working group meetings for further follow-up as needed. Okay, so Angela De La Porta, I thought I would just turn to you because you had sent an email sort of initiating a question, and you were representing a number of other board members. So if you want to just take, and if we can try to keep this to about 15 minutes, and then with some opportunity for dialogue, of course, with staff and the working group too.
We're going to be addressing a lot of the things that the public has just addressed, so that's kind of convenient. So I'm going to let Kirsten begin this, and we are going to be asking your opinions about all of this. So we want to get feedback and ideas. Okay.
So, yeah, this presentation is for discussion purposes. We kind of found that we were asking some of the same questions, and we thought it might be worth presenting it to the whole group to see if they sort of had the same questions also. Basically, we have a challenging job ahead. We have to absorb a huge amount of material in a relatively short time. We want to come up with a plan, and we want everyone to be happy with the result. So, oops, should I do it?
Yeah, because then,
Okay.
well, we can trade. I can do it too.
So, to that end, we've created a proposal, and Angela will read the next part.
Okay, so we
Oh,
actually,
wait. Oh, yeah, that's me. Sorry. We're strictly amateurs here. So, studies have shown that the most effective group decision-making process emphasizes collaboration, dialogue, and discussion to create true consensus and prevent mistrust and resentment amongst the stakeholders, speed the process towards a solution, and create a solution that is widely acceptable and pleasing to all. We want to make a final plan that has buy-in from everybody concerned, and then that will facilitate it not being held up by people who think they have not been heard. So, okay.
okay, the next one? Okay, so we wanted to share with you this diagram, I guess you'd call it, describing the different levels, the spectrum of involvement that people might have in a process like this. And I did make copies, I don't know if everyone got one, of
Actually, while you're reading, I'll pass them out if
okay.
someone wants them.
I think most people got them except maybe Keith and Seeing, and then you guys didn't get them, but would you like one? I'm not sure. Okay. Oh, this is this. So used to passing out papers. Yeah. And then, yeah, okay. So this diagram describes the different levels, and what I'd like to point out specifically, the collaboration one. That's what we're aiming for. We want collaboration because that does lead to the best result overall. So under collaboration, the public participation is that the working group will partner with the public in every aspect of the decision, including the development of alternatives and the identification of the preferred solution. We, as the working group and the city and the consultants, work together to formulate solutions and incorporate advice and recommendations to the maximum extent possible. So that's different from just keeping people informed. That's really working together, and that's what we're aiming for. That's what we want, and we believe that's what this process has been described as. Sorry, I'm so
There you
used
go.
to, there we go. Okay, so,
We are asking for.
well, yeah, so our first proposal has actually 7 bits, 7 parts, and we're going to stop at the end of the 7. We're going to go through them as quickly as possible, and then we'll stop and ask for any questions or comments people have about the things, and we can decide if we want to do them or not. We're not sort of saying you have to do this by any means. I mean, how could we? But we want to get ideas. So we know that the SOFA, the South of Forest Area Working Group, was extremely successful. And we know that Jonathan has said we want to model our group on that process. And we also know that the SOFA Working Group 1 and SOFA 2, there were 2 different phases, SOFA 1 and SOFA 2. And after SOFA 1, the working group at that time realized they really wanted a liaison between the working group and the city and the consultants. And so they elected actually 2 co-chairs from the working group, one from among residents and one from among property developers. These co-chairs acted as liaisons, and they dealt with the communication needs, and they helped to set the agenda for each meeting. And that was recommended by the SOFA group. And we're hoping that, that this would actually aid in our process and help everyone feel that they are collaborating and not just being informed. Another thing that we really are aware of is that more information will usually lead to a better decision. So we would like to get a really full and complete existing conditions report. We did get an existing conditions report in our second meeting, and it had a lot of important information in it. But we realized that the SOFA group, the SOFA working group, had a lot more detailed information before they even started making decisions or designs. And we think that more information will help us make better decisions.
So
Go
we
ahead.
would love existing conditions report that has information on hydrology, including the creek, vegetation and wildlife, public and environmental safety, public services and utilities, cultural and historic resources, visual quality and design, geological and seismic hazards, a detailed market feasibility study, this is essential and the public was asking for that, noise, a noise map, complete detailed zoning maps that may be down to the parcel level, existing recently completed and approved buildings, square feet, because it sort of speaks to the permit process of what's already in work. With information on the number of square feet of office that is in that building, the number of housing units, the number of retail units, and comparison to that density in downtown Palo Alto. Requirements and restrictions regarding development in this area, i.e. open space required as per the comprehensive plan and other city guidelines. Some of this might be just so native to people who do planning all the time that you don't realize that we don't know it. You know what I mean? So we'd love to have that information as we start to make decisions about the Nvcap area.
We also feel that questions regarding the draft existing conditions report should be addressed at the working group meetings, because that's the way everyone can hear the answers to the questions that are asked. And it also makes sense to us that the draft existing conditions report should be amended where there are maybe some gaps or some mistakes or something that needs to be understood more fully before designs are made, because it doesn't make sense to make designs based on flawed information or missing information, incomplete information. And then several neighbors have asked to see the full existing conditions report, not just a summary. So that should be available to all the working group members and to the public, we feel. All that information, it sounds like a lot of information, and it is a lot of information, but it was available to the SOFA working group, and we feel that we would make better decisions if we had that information.
So, communication between the working group members and the staff should be easier and frequent. Questions should be answered promptly. All relevant information obtained by the city and the consultants should be available to the working group members. One example might be that the transcripts of the stakeholder meetings would be very informative to the working group members.
The only time that we can actually discuss in the working group as a whole, all together, the issues that we need to discuss is here in this room, in front of the public. And we also know that dialogue and discussion are crucial for us coming up with a really good plan that people will feel comfortable with and accept. So we need ample time allotted during the meetings for this dialogue and discussion. It might seem counterintuitive, but we think that ample time here for us to iron out any problems will save time at the end, because we will have full buy-in from the public, from the people who are involved. Nobody will start putting up a resistance, and people won't feel left out. And so we think that ample time now will save time later.
So design should reflect and be responsive to the expressed project goals and opinions of the stakeholders, residents, working group members, the city, and the property owners. We understand that there are project limitations and constraints on what can be done here, but we want to know more about what they are, so solution will meet as much of everyone's wish list. Everyone has a wish list about this project as possible, and the only way we can do that is if we know what the wish list is and what the constraints are.
We promised Mr. Collins, we had this in originally. We
Make it for you.
Yeah, we didn't just add this in at the last minute. We heard what you said at the last meeting, and we agree that a representative from the school district should be on the working group to act as a liaison and help us make a decision about schools in the Ventura neighborhood.
So if you don't know where you're going, how will you know when you get there, is sort of the question of this slide. And we feel like a clear statement should be made describing the definition of what would be a successful outcome of this process, how decisions on the final recommendation will be made, who will be writing it, and the responsibilities or contributions expected from each individual or party to this group.
So that's our first proposal. And I know it's really long, and I promise the second proposal is much shorter, so don't worry. But we'd like to take a few minutes just to discuss these ideas and see if people agree with them and make a decision about whether or not we should use some of them. I did pass out this dense-looking sheet that says NVCAP Working Group meeting April 17th at the top. It sort of lists all of them under Proposal 1.
I'll take these in.
And so that way you can look at all of them and see if you want to ask questions or bring up comments or make comments about them, or if you'd like to say anything else about them. Anyone want to say something supporting any of them or the opposite?
So yes.
Yes, great. Okay, thank you.
First, just a quick time check. We're about a little over 10 minutes into the discussion, and we do have a full agenda of other items
Yeah.
that we do
We
need
understand,
to take on.
yeah.
I want to thank you for putting this together, and I'm heartened by the fact that I don't think there's a lot of misalignment in our interest in what you've been reporting. So I think that's good. I think there are some areas where there's just I think communication has been a challenge maybe in some of these areas where when I look at this list under 2, all these different studies and everything that you're interested in, we're absolutely doing that. The question is, when are we doing it? And I get the sense that the working group has been at this place where we've been talking at you a lot about trying to set the foundation for, frankly, the conversation that we want to have today, which is exactly sort of beginning to get our thoughts and our ideas around what does the area look like. And I don't know that it's a sequential type of a discussion where you necessarily need to have, all this information that you're looking for up front before you can begin to explore some of these other areas here. I do think I don't want to go over each one of the points here, but individual working group members may have some ideas about this, but I do think that it may be helpful if staff maybe met with the 2 of you, and maybe Terry, I know you've had some ideas too. I'm wondering if there's another conversation that we can have outside of the working group where we can actually go over these in a little bit more detail, because some of these things we're getting to. Some of them, the council didn't direct us to do that. And in other areas, I just think there's some misinformation. I mean, the economic study that we've done is of the existing conditions, and Sujata at the end of the table here is our economic consultant, and we are going to be preparing a very robust economic analysis, because at the end of the day, if there's not enough economic interest in redeveloping the Fry's site specifically, we don't have much of a plan. I mean, this whole North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan has identified the Fry's site specifically as the housing opportunity site where we can get more housing. And as you know, and this is where Sujata will come in, there's probably a fair amount of economic of revenue being generated by the existing building, where there may not even be enough incentive for the property owner to even want to redevelop the site. And so that may be a very real scenario that we have, and whether or not there's enough interest in the community to tolerate something that would be able to encourage redevelopment of that property. That's kind of what we want to have today in terms of our discussion, and begin to understand all these different areas that we've been talking about with the stream, which is, a hugely important issue, a lot of emotional interest in the stream and daylighting it, and we're going to have explore that to the reality of what does it take to daylight that stream in the constrained space that we have, at the costs that may be involved, and also meeting the hazard issues that we know that underlie the area. So I don't want to stifle working group participation in this or the next proposal that we'll hear about, but I do want to make myself available, and Elena and Geeti as well, to participate outside of the working group meeting to actually go over this proposal in great detail and understand where I think we have areas of alignment and we can work together on it, and areas where we may have to pose a question to the city council and say, we have this interest that's been expressed, and here's what it means in terms of schedule or cost, or even improving the sort of the trust in the outcome, which is essential. If we don't have that, there's no point in all of us spending this time away from our families and doing this. So that we clearly share an interest in. But so I'll pause there. I think that we can answer a lot of these questions, and it might be that we want to report back on those at the appropriate time by email before the next working group meeting or something.
If there are more than 6 people that want to take this offline, if there are more than 6 people who sort of support this from the working group, is there a Brown Act issue? Will that have to be a Brown Act meeting? Because
Yeah, so I guess.
it's not just the 2 of us.
No,
It's
I
just we're the ones that are
Yeah,
talking.
you got the lucky, you drew the short straw. I think it would be helpful to have, we don't want to make this a meeting that's subject to the Brown Act. I mean, I don't think there's any need to do that. I suppose we could just schedule another meeting on that. But I would think that there's a representative sort of interests that can be identified. The 2 of you, Terry, maybe Doria, maybe there's others who are just really, wanting to be a part of that discussion. I don't know that we need a scheduled Brown Act meeting for that. Okay. So again, I just want to be, the irony here is we're poised to do the kind of thing that you want to do today. And the more that we talk about process and questions about this, it just keeps us from getting into that. I'm already concerned that we're not going to have the time that we need to fully, you guys will work some magic and make it happen, I'm sure. So it's a question really to the group. I mean, we can talk more about the process and the other proposal, or we can get into it.
So the other proposal.
And this is, right, no, I agree with that. And the constraint, of course, is we knew going into this that it was going to be an aggressive schedule. I mean, I was wondering whether or not this was a grant that we even wanted to apply for, because I wasn't sure that Palo Alto could adhere to the 2-year time schedule in which to draft a coordinated area plan.
We did start late.
No, we're not starting, we're starting from when we started. We're not starting from back in January, but part of this, and we can have this as part of our conversation, I mean, there aren't a whole lot of months available for decision-making in this community with, vacations, summer, elections appear every couple of years. I mean, these are all things that factor into, when decisions, get made. And so I empathize, I sympathize actually with what the time constraint, because we're feeling it too, very acutely. And I think our consultants are feeling it even more acutely than we are, because this is something that we're all trying to make happen. So.
What I want to ask is, do other members of the working group feel comfortable with the idea of postponing a decision on this proposal, on Proposal 1, until our next meeting, until after some of us have had a chance to meet with the city? I see nods. Okay, all right, am I understanding? Yes, please.
I have some trepidation about it, I guess, because my fear is that, and this is important, I understand that we have time limits and we have restrictions on time because the council said by November we need to come up with a plan.
Not just council, but the council is responding to requirements of the grant.
Oh, I got it, okay.
And I don't know how much is it 650,000 that we've committed to accepting in response for delivering a product, a plan within 2 years. That's
By November, basically.
Yeah.
That's true, okay. And I totally understand that, and I understand, but I also think that if we create a plan that the community is not behind, if we create a plan that people have problems with or issues with, you'll have much bigger issues than losing $650,000, much bigger issues. And I think you'll lose trust of the public, and you don't want that either. So I think it's critical, and maybe there does need to be some pushback on time. I don't know, but I mean, I'd be more than willing to come to council and tell them, that we need more time if that's necessary. But I also think that, we need to do the best job that we can with the information we're given, and part of the reason why we got together, a few of us, is because we felt we did not have adequate information. And frustration with that.
And you're right. We haven't done the type of analysis yet that you are craving. What we've done is existing conditions. We've gotten familiar with the site. We've tried to understand the circulation, how to access different areas by the various modes of transportation. And we're trying to, understand all of the sort of decisions that go into redesigning or planning for a neighborhood. So I'll pause there.
Good.
We're hopeful that we're trying to offer solutions, and that's kind of a good segue into the next little
Yes.
thing, if
Yes.
you're willing to sit still for it.
And this we don't have to sort of make a decision on now, but, well, I hope we can make a decision on Proposal 1 next time we meet, since most people were nodding. Anyway, okay, Proposal 2, much shorter. We do realize there's a lot of information that needs to be gathered And we do realize also, I mean, I know from grad school that it makes more sense to divide up the work and then come back and report together to everyone on the in-depth research that is necessary for large amounts of information. And so we thought, why don't we create some subcommittees, obviously fewer than six working group members per subcommittee, to team up with local experts. We already know several local experts who are interested in helping us gather information, and do some of that research so that the subcommittees can report back to the group.
So the subcommittees will become sort of our knowledgeable person on the topics on the following 6 subjects: the creek, hydrology, flood control, possibility of renaturalization, historical and cultural preservation, maintenance of the diversity that we are all very committed to in the neighborhood character, financial analysis of neighborhood serving retail and small office, what has worked in other cities with similar developments, financial analysis of housing, so they would partner with your financial analyst here. How many units can be reasonably expected? What kind of profit can be expected from this type of development? Research on potential income sources. For example, tech companies sometimes are willing to step in to help with worker housing category of housing. Environment. Oh, that's yours.
You might as well go ahead.
Okay, how dangerous is the toxic plume? How can it be mitigated? How is it safe during construction? And environmental building standards and ideas. And then finally, modalities, transportation. This is a subcommittee that would study parking, car traffic, walking, biking, and public transportation.
And come up with some nice plans and designs that, and again, this would all be to complement the work that you guys already do. We would be doing it sort of in addition to, and to help and support what you already do.
From the citizens' side.
From the citizens'
Yeah.
side,
We are
exactly.
not experts. We know that.
So we're not sure how much enthusiasm there will be, but on the back of the page that I gave you, there's a little proposal too. And if you are interested in being on one of the committees, please indicate somehow which one you might be interested in serving on and put your name at the bottom. And because of the Brown Act situation, we'll just, sorry, Elena, we'll ask you to communicate with people and let them know if there's which people are interested in which committees, if any. And if you'd like to ask some questions, not that I can answer any more than we've already done, but if you'd like to, then please feel free to talk to us after the meeting. So this is, for you to fill out if you're interested. Okay?
Now we done.
Yeah, we're done. Any questions, though? Comments?
Okay.
Other people are going on this. Proposal 2 is important and detailed. It's also related to what happens to, in my view, what happens to Proposal 1. And I guess my question is, because we have a lot of core issues we still need to talk about, is an idea of subcommittees, et cetera, from the consultant team's point of view and the staff's point of view, would that require staff be attending those meetings, or would this be a kind of a freestanding shadow committee structure that you'd bring things back to the committee? Because that can get very, very confusing.
That was our idea, that it would be freestanding and sort of from the citizens' point of view. And it would just complement the information that the city brings to us.
And
Yeah.
just a general comment, and then I'll be quiet because we have a lot more to do. We're paying consultants to do a lot of this work, and they have the expertise. I guess my observation would be that citizens clearly have ideas and creative ideas, et cetera. It might be preferable to consider having that input once we have kind of the core pieces to respond to, because we do have this timing pressure. And I guess I'm saying I recognize my view is give the consultants and staff chance to really put things out there that we can really respond to. Because I think of your concerns are certainly legitimate, but I think we're jumping too fast. There will be a feasibility study, there will be an economic analysis, but that's just my observation based on my professional experience.
I really appreciate that. And I just want to say that we know that the SOFA, at least we were told, that the SOFA group had all that information, an economic feasibility study and all the other information before they started, which is very helpful because it's hard to make decisions without the information. So that's all, yeah.
If I might, I'm just curious. I'm not familiar with the SOFA. How was it funded and what was the time period that all of that happened in?
Thanks. That's a question we get asked a lot, and I actually don't know the answer. Karen Holman is in the room, and she may have some knowledge about that. But do you know?
Well, I mean, I think it was partial. One of the key differences with SOFA was that there was a large property owner that was involved that owns a significant part of the SOFA, so they paid for a portion of the study, at least a portion of it.
And how long did that whole community process and development plan take?
I believe it lasted three to 4 years, and Karen can verify.
It lasted actually quite a long time. That's why it was divided into phase one, which was where there was a significant property owner, that being the Palo Alto Clinic. They were not the exclusive owners of property there, but they were a primary, just as I think here there are a couple of primary property owners. It was divided into two phases because it was taking long enough, and it was rather unique. It's one of the criticisms of, pretty much the only criticism of that working group, and the process was because it took so long. It's because we went through either 4 or 5 planning directors in that period of time. So there were long gaps. Seriously. So unless you have plans to move to Florida, Jonathan, we're not worried about that happening this time. So, but that's why it was divided into SOFA 1 and SOFA 2. But SOFA 2 actually happened in a much more timely fashion. And that was multiple property owners. And just to be clear, the co-chairs of SOFA 2 were actually myself as a resident and Larry Hassett, who is both property owner and business owner, that being Ace Hardware.
Okay. So thank you, Kirsten and Angela, for bringing that to the discussion. I do think that it's important that we continue this dialogue. I mean, I really don't want to, all of us wants this process to succeed. And clearly there's some opportunities for us to enhance our communication among staff and with the working group in terms of expectations and roles and how do we get more of the things that we want, sooner, or when can we expect that they're going to play out down the road? And where there's something that is contrary to the course that we've laid out, let's check in with the council. And in fact, we are checking in with the council in May to report back on the town hall direction that we received. So that could be a good opportunity for us to raise some of these issues at that meeting too, so that we can get council guidance.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yeah, super quick, and then, because we only have 2 hours to do a 3-hour exercise. So I hear your comments, and I was expecting a little bit more exchange of ideas at that meeting, and I think when the moment presented itself, it didn't happen. And so that was kind of a unique meeting where it was a town hall. The meeting in May is going to be a formal council meeting, and I know you're familiar with how those meetings go. but we can certainly, I hear your comments on that as well. Okay, super quick, Doria.
So, I want to thank Gail Price for what she said, and it occurred to me when we were working on this that we might be getting many of these materials we were asking for. I think the problem from my point of view is how few meetings we have left to really have a dialogue, and we were very concerned that we would just end up with a lot of people being surprised, and not in a good way, by what was being proposed. So maybe what we need to do is add meetings, and I would be perfectly happy to make that commitment, because I think we're getting too close to the end of the project, and we have not had a dialogue amongst ourselves, and that was our goal. So I just wanted to say that.
So let's leave it there, and Kristen, it's your show.
All right. Well, I hope.
One brief so food, right? We feed you guys, and the food arrived while we were talking. So please walk out and get some food and bring it back in and do that. And
Tell them to walk out just as I start talking.
I can bring the food in. You don't need to hear this part.
Yeah.
Should we go like in groups, so we're not all disappearing at once? That's like in a.
Let's listen.
We could do it like a wedding. We'll announce
Yes.
different tables at different times. All right, at the end of the table, you might know. I won't be offended. I promise. Okay, so today we are going to give you a little bit of a schedule update, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what we've heard over the last few meetings as a way to kind of set up a framework for planning. And what you see here on these tables is the activity that we're really itching to get to. And I think everybody here, even Waldeck at the first meeting, was like, when are we going to get our hands on materials and start drawing things? So that's the plan for today. So we're going to give you some background, and really looking at this list that you proposed of the elements on the subcommittees, I mean, it's kind of our hope to make all of you sort of mini experts in these topic areas, and to give you the knowledge that you need in order to help kind of understand the trade-offs and decision-making for all of these elements. So we'll talk through that. We'll talk about the historic context. We'll talk about what's happening with the creek. We'll talk through some ideas about open space and mobility, and then kind of that starts to lay out what we'll call an urban design framework upon which we will all start picking up elements and putting them down together and having conversations. And then we, as part of that too, we'll talk about the different building types that could happen here, potential uses. We'll do that planning game together, and then we'll report out on it. So each group is going to break into we're going to have 3 tables, and we'll break into 3 groups, and each group will together work through this planning game, and then we'll report out. And we have our economics consultant here, Sujata, and we have our transportation consultant, Autumn, here, and they are on hand to help answer questions as they come up. And we want to do a kind of a wrap-up at the end where we can get some feedback on the ideas shared from them, and also from those of us from Perkins and Well. So just to look at where we are on this timeline, we are here on April 17th, if you can see that line that says we are here, in the middle of develop plan options. So we started with our existing conditions stuff. We moved into some visioning exercises around places that we thought were good examples that we could borrow some ideas from for this place. And then we had our workshop where we got a lot of feedback. And it was our first chance to kind of get our hands on a plan. And here we are at Working Group 5, where we really will be getting our hands on the plan more intensely. We're going to come back at the next working group meeting, having taken these 3 plans and kind of distilled them into 2 to get your feedback and input on those ideas. The idea from that is we will take that same material out to the community and get feedback and input from them on those ideas. And we're trying to work towards 2 plans that can kind of bracket the different options, and that's what will be studied with an economic feasibility and many of the elements on this list: noise, the environmental quality, a lot of the things that will happen in the environmental study. And then from there, we'll move into, after that community workshop, we'll move into kind of the preferred plan development, where we take elements of that and decide what we think we want to keep and what we think we want to jettison. And throughout this whole time, we'll be going to City Council for periodic check-ins. So that's where we are in the schedule now. Just looking at some of the things we've heard, and I think these, we've heard them here, we've heard them at the community workshops. There's been a lot of interest in keeping this a kind of a diverse place and a lot of characteristics in terms of the existing diversity, ethnic diversity, income diversity, diversity of types of housing, diversity of types of places. So that's been a big theme that we've heard. We've heard a desire for really high quality mobility infrastructure, specifically bikes and walking. How do we make this a really wonderful place to walk and bike and safe place? A desire for street trees. I think we've all seen that the canopy here is a beautiful part of Palo Alto, really character defining. How can we kind of bring that green into this area? A desire for really beautiful architecture that's elegant and inspiring, and comfortable streets that don't feel like canyons. We've heard ideas how to do that around setbacks and different kinds of design guidelines. We've heard a lot about the creek, the opportunity of the creek, the desire for this to be a kind of a showcase for the creek, and a lot about housing, a need for housing, a desire for affordable housing, and diverse types of housing. So Rachel's going to talk a little bit about what we're calling our planning framework.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah. Scoot over. Hi. So I'm just going to offer some sort of foundations to our planning framework. We're going to start with the historic context, and we know you received the draft report of the historic resource analysis, so we're going to make this fairly quick. But basically highlighting what the report looks at, which are two structures, the Fry's building and the office building on Ash Street. We've also highlighted the railway spur, as that also has historic significance, as it served as during the period when this was operating as a canning facility. We've highlighted the two rectangular red squares are just to highlight the two architectural features that are quite compelling, and also they represent the two eras of significance. So the red rectangle that's sort of to the northeast there is from the Chu family era, and that's with the monitor roof structure. And then to the southwest is from the Sutter packing era, and that's with the bow and truss featured architecture that you can see in the picture there, bottom left. So in terms of the historic context, the plan area was in the town of Mayfield that was formed in 1855 and then was annexed by Palo Alto in 1925. The Fry's building, which as we all know is a complex of a bunch of different warehouses, was added over time, and currently, and this is one of the most important kind of points of the report, currently it's not listed on the National Register or the California Register. However, due to the events that occurred here, it is eligible for listing on the California Register at the local level. And so the events, as we know, has to do with the canning industry. And there aren't actually many buildings in the area that represent this history, so it's something that could really showcase canning industry in Santa Clara County and understanding and acknowledging the events that occurred here. No other buildings within the Nvcap boundary are eligible as historic resources, as the report, basically confirms. So how does this sort of impact our process? The first important thing to acknowledge is that our plan really needs to help tell this history and tell this story, and sort of up to us to understand what our options are. There's no specific criteria for what we have to do in terms of what part of the building we would retain, or whether or not we would highlight the railway spur, but the idea is that we want to come up with some plans that really communicate to people this historic interest and importance. So we could retain part of the building. There's the potential to retain the office building and part of the Fry's building. I mean, all options are kind of on the table, and the point is that we want to study those together to make a really compelling case for interpreting and communicating this history. And then also just that because it's eligible, the proposal and plan will be reviewed as part of the CEQA process for its historic resource. So moving on, just to speak briefly on the creek, we know that basically the creek is under the jurisdiction of the Santa Clara Valley Water District. So inclusive of the creek, there's a 60-foot easement, and that's all beneath the jurisdiction of the water district. And right now it provides 100-year flood control for the Matadero watershed, and any change that would happen, any type of naturalization or any type of design change, would still need to maintain that function. As was mentioned, there's a contamination plume beneath the site. Currently, it's not actually beneath the creek, but there's the potential for migration of that plume. So we have to be very careful in understanding sort of what the implications are. So I think everyone will be happy to hear this. We are assembling a team of consultants to analyze the feasibility of 3 scenarios, and that team of consultants will have a hydrologist, a landscape architect, biologist, environmental engineer, to look, to create a very thorough kind of study of the feasibility of these options, and part of that is also sort of a cost analysis, and also, very importantly, to understand how much land we would need to acquire to make these options viable. So the first option is naturalization and the removal of the concrete channel within the plant area. The second scenario would be partial naturalization and partial removal of the concrete channel. And the third option would be the retention of this engineered concrete channel, but with occupiable landscape space adjacent to the channel. Yeah.
Can I offer that you add a fourth,
Sure.
putting a top on it and using the top as public space? Thank you.
One more comment too. Bulwer Park is just down the road, and that borders on Bulwer Park.
Yep.
Are we looking just at the portion of the creek that's going to be on the Fry's property, or are we going to be also looking at the impacts to Bulwer Park?
So we are coordinating with our Public Works Department, and so that will be considered.
Okay, thank you.
So the next sort of foundation we want to talk about is open space, and we know how important this is as a community amenity. And we also know that the existing open space, so Sarah Wallace Park and Bulwer Park, are not necessarily adequately serving the community. And also, particularly that the middle of the site is underserved, even if Bulwer Park is extended. And so the extension has to do with the city putting in an offer for that part of the AT&T parcel, which we have outlined here in red. So if that extension were to happen, it would bring Bulwer Park up to about 2 acres, a little over, which is kind of the size of a neighborhood park. Additionally, we're looking at potential open space within our plan area, and based on what we've heard, there's a lot of interest for a linear park along the creek, and obviously that's part of what we're studying right now with this team of consultants. But we're also looking at the potential for using the historic railway spur as an opportunity for open space. So these are sort of 2 of our kind of suggestions or recommendations. Yeah. Yeah.
I challenge that the 1.2 acre piece is not very thoughtful yet. I think if you look at what the shortfall is of what the parks are, if you're looking at redeveloping the site, and I'm not proposing that we are, but if we are looking at proposing redeveloping the whole site, there might be a better way of approaching what you're looking for by establishing 1.2 acres comes out of whatever design comes into the park versus just willy-nilly picking an old rail spur that was closed in 1968 that goes nowhere, that affects your ability to develop the remainder and not necessarily achieves a cohesive park because it goes from nowhere to park. So I think I would challenge that this isn't the exact right approach to talk about open space in future development of the site. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And today, part of the game is to talk just about that. And sort of, these are really just suggestions, but by no means is it where we're putting open space. So thank you for that comment.
I think it's misleading to put it on the map.
Quick question, there are guidelines on how much parkland a neighborhood should have, but I don't know what they are. So if
It's 4 acres for every 1,000 residents. So you have to consider how many residents are going to be added to this and then multiply that by 4 acres.
And of course, Boulevard Park also accounts for the residents outside of the working
Plan
group
area.
area. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to actually move through the presentation and save some questions for after, just for time? Sure. Okay. So thank you for those comments. I'm going to move on to our transportation consultant, Autumn.
So hi, everyone. This is my first meeting. I'm Autumn Bernstein, and I'm a transportation planner with ARUP, and I'm also a native of Mountain View, California. And my grandmother lives here in Palo Alto, and I visited her today before I came over. So very happy to be working in a community that I've known all my life. So we've spent some time thinking about mobility, and as of course you saw the existing conditions report that we put together. So I wanted to just quickly highlight some of the things that we think are important, and I want to clarify that these are not really recommendations at this point, but really I want to give you the idea that this is a sense of these are constraints and opportunities that are going to need to be balanced as part of the overall plan. So I would encourage you to think about these as things to keep in your head as we're working through the plan, as opposed to specific recommendations at this point. So I have this is kind of my overview slide, and I'm going to go through each one of these things in details just to give you a sense of kind of where we're headed. We want to talk about El Camino in Oregon. We want to talk about site access and internal connectivity, because this is a unique site that's kind of bifurcated currently, right, from a transportation perspective. We want to talk about Park Boulevard. We want to talk about parking. We want to talk about Portage Ave. And we want to talk about traffic calming in the existing Olive and Pepper neighborhood. So those are the areas we're going to cover. And I'm going to try to go really fast. So in terms of El Camino Real and Oregon Expressway, there's a lot of stuff being planned already for this area. In particular, the county is looking at adding carpool lanes for Page Mill on the going westbound towards 280, not on the Oregon Expressway side, as far as we know at this point. There's not a specific timeline or a lot of details about those improvements, but they are in the works. However, from our analysis, we think that and I think one of the public speakers actually brought this up, that the right turn from El Camino onto Oregon Expressway for people trying to get to 101 really backs up in the morning, and that is a factor that is driving a lot of the cut-through traffic in the neighborhood. So we think it's worth looking at potentially a new right turn lane from El Camino onto Oregon Expressway so that people can move through that intersection and not be stopped by everyone who is just waiting to go through the light. So that's a key piece here that we want to think about. Along with that, it's important to think about bicycle and pedestrian crossings, because we know that there's a lot of conflicts in this area. There are people who use El Camino Real on bicycles, and crossing these major streets is a big hazard. And then we have here, and I know a couple of the speakers brought this up as well, the possibility of a bike ped crossing at Ash. This is something that the reason that we factored this in is when we were doing our observations for the existing conditions report, we saw people doing this. We saw multiple pedestrians and at least one bicyclist, which was actually kind of terrifying, trying to carry his bike up and over the center divide. So it's a concern from the perspective that we see that people are doing it currently. And also, as we get further into the conversation, as we improve connectivity across the site, we think there could be actually more people trying to cross here if they're kind of coming through from the new development on the Fry site. So we're concerned that this could be a problem that gets actually worse in the future if something is not done about it. Again, a crossing might be quite expensive and cost prohibitive. But if we don't look at it, and if we don't think it's something that's feasible, we need to think about how do we discourage people from crossing there by directing them to other places that are safer to cross, and potentially even making it difficult or impossible to cross on foot. So it's just something we need to really be thinking about and aware of, because we don't want to be putting people in harm's way. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So in terms of thinking about improvements at this intersection, the Palo Alto Grand Boulevard safety study that recently came out, we looked at that and we actually thought that they had a very compelling vision for improving this intersection for bicyclists and pedestrians, and it involves having protected bike lanes on El Camino, so where there's a physical separation between bicyclists and pedestrians, between bicycles and cars for a couple of blocks, because we know that there's so many people coming from from Stanford Research Park and trying to get across to California Avenue train station and whatnot, not to mention people crossing for schools, that this is an area that if possible, we can make it more safe for bikes is really going to help a lot. There are a lot of bicycle and pedestrian collisions in this area. So I just wanted to highlight that study as something that, folks in the working group might want to take a look at and think about whether or not there's recommendations there that you would like to incorporate into this plan. Yeah.
Equals bikes?
Yes, in this case, and pedestrian. So it's. I know it's a little bit hard to see. It's pretty small. I blew it up as big as I could. But yeah, so the green is the areas that would be striped, but there's actually continuous separated bike lanes on both sides of El Camino all across this diagram. Moving on to Park Boulevard. So one of the things we've thought about is improving, and we've heard from you all that improving bicycle and pedestrian travel on Park is really important. So we came up with the idea, and then we later realized that the city was also thinking about the idea of a two-way cycle track on the north side of Park. So that's the side that's closest to the railroad tracks, having essentially bikes go both directions on that side of the street and then have a physical barrier between them and the cars. And the reason we think that makes sense is because there's going to be a lot of left-hand turns. People going left, if they're going on Park towards California Avenue, people make left turns, right, to get onto Oregon Expressway. And with the new development in the site, there'll be people making left turns to get into the Fry's site. So by having it on the north side, bicyclists can kind of move through this area. There are driveways there that we would need to look at, because that does create potential conflicts, but we think it will help avoid and minimize conflicts to bicyclists passing through the area when you have, as the site builds out. So again, just something to think about. It needs to be studied, but that was an initial idea. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to be clear that, I'm Sylvia, Transportation Manager for the city. Just want to be clear that this graphic is a little bit off because that cycle track is not already planned by the city. It was an idea that was thrown into play, but it's actually not planned. We have no plans to do that, but if you are the body that decides that's what you want.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So, sorry about that, Sylvia. And so as part of that, again, we might want to think about consolidating driveways as future development happens on the north side of Park Boulevard to minimize conflicts. And also, and then at Portage and also at the turn onto Oregon Expressway, signals would be something that we'd want to think about, having traffic signals, because currently there is no Portage. It's basically just the entrance to the Fry's parking lot. But clearly, if that becomes a way that people are getting in and out of the site, that would likely need a signal. And then at the Oregon on-ramp, or kind of Page Mill as it's called, there may be a need to have a signal that has a left-hand turn, because you could anticipate potentially more people using that intersection, again, depending on how we want to think about traffic going in and out of the site. Okay, moving on to Portage. Portage is really the primary route at this point in and out of the Fry's site, because it has a signalized intersection at El Camino Real. And it's also a really important bicycle and pedestrian route, because Hanson Way on the other side of El Camino is a way that a lot of people come and then they cross and they make that kind of funny zigzag from Hanson across El Camino onto Portage. So this is an area that we think needs a lot of study to think about. If with future development, there's going to be more cars, and also we want to make sure it's safe for bicyclists who are also really using the site using that crossing quite a bit. The Palo Alto Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan also calls for a Class 3 bike lane from El Camino to Park on Portage. So again, that's just something that's an existing plan that has not yet been implemented, but just something to keep in mind that's something that has been identified as a priority. And then there's a question about Portage doesn't actually go all the way to Park right now. It dead ends at the Fry's parking lot. And so thinking about whether or not you want to continue that all the way to Park is an important question. That will, of course, have impacts on Park Boulevard if you have cars from the site, using Park Boulevard as access. Versus keeping it as a dead end and having all the cars just using Portage to get down and out of the site. So, this is an area that the site currently has, fairly limited connectivity. And so thinking about where we want cars to be going in the future, I think is a really important question because there's so few ways in and out of the site. So food for thought. And here's an aerial of the current intersection of Portage and Hanson and El Camino. And it's, it is this kind of weird zigzag currently, and we think there may be ways to improve the way this intersection is designed and or operated to make it safer. It is a hot spot right now for bicycle collisions, as I mentioned. And so, making it safer was a priority that was also identified in this Grand Boulevard safety study. This is the design that they came up with in terms of, which would allow bicyclists to go basically straight across at Portage and then have a protected way to get over to Hanson. So again, something to just think about. This is some planning work that's been done that this committee may want to pick up on. And then not lastly, but next up is talking about Olive and Pepper traffic calming. As we talked about, there's a lot of cut-through traffic in the neighborhood. And so one suggestion we had was to ban left turns onto Ash from Pepper and Olive, which would prevent people from getting to Oregon Expressway, which is what they're trying to do currently. There was a question that was raised in an email and here tonight about what the impact that might have on Park. Would that encourage more people to go to Park? And that is a possibility, but the reason that we think that that's not likely is because it's not going to be as fast, because in order to get onto Oregon Expressway, if you take Olive, you've got to make a left on Park and then another left to get onto Oregon Expressway, and left turns are just more congested and more difficult. The way people are cutting through now, they make that easy right turn onto Pepper or Olive and then an easy right turn from Ash onto Oregon Expressway. The left turn on Ash, there's no traffic on Ash, so it's fast for people to do that. It would not be as fast to try to do that by making a left onto Park and then another left onto Oregon Expressway. That's our assumption. You folks who live in the area, you may know better than, and if you think that that's not true, we want to hear that from you. Another idea we had, rather than doing the left turn thing, if we think that that's a potential concern, is to make at least Pepper and potentially even Olive one way towards El Camino. In other words, so you just literally wouldn't be able to make a right turn because you would have to, only from Pepper you would only be able to go towards El Camino. That would obviously have impacts on the residents of those streets. It means, you all would have to drive around more to get to your homes, but it would also, be a pretty effective strategy to calm the traffic in the area. So again, food for thought. And I just also wanted to note, there is a planned signalized crosswalk across El Camino Real at Olive. This is mitigation. This is a required mitigation measure for some of the new development that's happening on the corner of Olive and El Camino. So that is coming. And so as part of that, we want to have traffic calming so that that's going to become a new kind of way for people to get across El Camino who are on bike or on foot. And so we want to make it safe for them. We want to continue the zone of safety by having speed bumps on Olive, any other traffic calming to just make sure that Olive is a safe place for bicyclists and pedestrians once they've crossed El Camino. Okay, and then site access and internal connectivity, as I've alluded to a couple times here, the site is really divided in two from a transportation perspective because there is a barrier essentially southeast of Olive Avenue. You just can't get through. So we've thought about what are some ways to increase connectivity within the site. So we've thought about the idea of potentially having a connector extending Ash from Olive all the way through to Acacia. That could be something you could do just as a bicycle and pedestrian path. It could potentially even be something that you could do so that vehicles could go through as well, which would obviously have some pretty big implications for the existing neighborhood if you had cars going through that area. But so it's something to think about in terms of connectivity. That if it was just a bicycle and pedestrian path, we think you could do that without even having to. You could just do it as an easement on somebody's driveway currently, because there are driveways there that go all the way back to the property line or to the fence line. So somebody could have an easement through their property to just turn that into a bicycle and pedestrian path. You wouldn't have to demolish homes or anything like that. Then this question about whether or not it makes sense to extend portage to park, which I kind of already mentioned. And I wanted to put these all on one slide because to raise the point that if we put it, when new development happens in this area, there's a question about where you want the traffic that is going to be associated with that to go. Do you want it all coming out to Portage onto El Camino Real, which is, as we know, quite congested already in the mornings? Do you want it going onto Park, which is a bicycle and pedestrian priority area? Or would you want it going through across all of onto Ash, onto Oregon Expressway, which in many ways would be the most direct way to get cars onto Oregon Expressway, but would mean there's more cars passing through the existing neighborhood. So these are all trade-offs, right? That you all on the working group are going to have to think about, what makes the most sense, because there will be some new traffic generated, and we want to do everything in our power to minimize the amount of new traffic that's generated by making it as bikeable and walkable and connected to Caltrain as possible. But there are going to be some new trips, and so where do we want to direct those new trips? And then lastly, just parking considerations. We should consider the impacts that, right now parking utilization in the area is extremely low. There's plenty of parking both on street and off based on our counts. But clearly that's going to change in the future with build out of the site. So we want to make sure we're considering impacts that are created by new development on the existing neighborhood. And then as much as for the build out of the plan area, really being thoughtful about both managing on-street parking so that people are not parking on the street all day, and making sure we have TDM requirements in place, transportation demand management requirements in place for new development, things like having free transit passes for residents and having secure bike parking and all the things that we know can encourage people to drive less or to give up their cars. And I'd be happy to go into more detail about that at a later time if there's questions about it. So I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Autumn. Lots to chew on there. The next little bit of conversation is about the parcel ownership, and this is a map we've showed you before with a little bit more detail. So on this, you can see the color corresponds to ownership. So the purple guy owns all the same property. Does that make sense? So all the property that's purple is owned by the same person. All the property that's dark blue is owned by the same person. So you can kind of see a pattern of ownership here, which starts to hint at some different potential ways that things might be developed over time given shared ownership and adjacency. And this has been sort of simplified on these plans so that you can see there's a kind of a dark orange outline, and this here is our urban design framework. So this kind of combines all of the elements that we've showed you onto one map, and this is the map that's going to be on your table that you have to work with. So the dark orange outline is that kind of common ownership. The blue intersections are the kind of external intersections that Autumn identified, and then we're showing some potential north-south connections, potential east-west connections, some kind of dashed outlines for these potential green areas, and this is all just sort of to let you remember the places that we've talked about during this framework while you're doing the exercise.
Sorry, I was confused about one portion. Orange rectangle that is in
The Cloudera parcel. Yeah, so we added that. It's currently a parking lot. We were a little bold here and said, what if that parking lot could be something else? And so it's just kind of out there as an opportunity. There's nothing on there right now except for surface parking. Yeah.
Also, just to be clear that the dotted arrows are suggestions of connectivity. We're not saying that this would have to be the geometry they would take. So again, you'll see that's highlighted in orange. It's a little faint, but there's that easement that Autumn talked about. So there is the capacity to have a north-south connection through Ash where you wouldn't remove any houses or anything. It's just, this is really just a suggestion of connectivity. Does that make sense? And we can talk about that in our breakout groups more.
Yeah, when you guys are sitting in front of the maps in these breakout groups, we can talk about any questions that come up there too.
Can you offer a clarification for the outline of the proposed open space? Is again indicated here, so it's going to guide us, maybe misguide us?
It's sort of just a suggestion, this idea kind of linking to that potential historic traces of the rail line. If it's not something that anybody feels is an interesting connection, as you said, maybe it doesn't connect to anywhere or from anywhere. It's just kind of a location. We're sort of tracing for you outlines of things that we've talked about during this meeting so you can remember geographically where they are.
And again, thinking of them as opportunities, and then there's also constraints. So we're not saying that's where the open space has to go.
I'd actually like to, sorry, is that okay if we move on? Because I want to get through the building typologies, and any questions you guys have about this we can ask at the tables. We're going to give you cards, and these cards are going to have different building typologies on them, and I just want to orient you a little bit to what these building typologies are. So the first possible building type is a townhome, and that's what's currently permitted on the site. It's about 30 dwelling units per acre, so you can imagine any of the kind of townhome developments that you've seen around, very similar density, 35 feet in height. This is a very lucrative for sale product. So typically people are purchasing these as homes, and they tend to have parking in the unit. So you've probably seen these where there's like sort of a parking spot underneath the townhome, and it's all kind of associated. So if you can imagine in your mind what that looks like, we've also provided some images here of what some other townhome developments look like. These are 2 images. There's a million different types that you could probably imagine, but just to give you kind of a feel and flavor of what that looks like. Another possible building type is multifamily residential or mixed use. It's also called type 5 in construction and architecture parlance. This is around 85 dwelling units per acre, so it's a little over twice as dense, almost 3 times as dense as townhomes, so a lot more units. This can range anywhere between 45 feet and 65 feet. The construction type is kind of within that range. So there's an option to include ground floor retail in this typology, whereas townhomes you don't tend to see kind of street-facing retail. As with the townhomes, as with any project, there'd be a requirement for at least 15% of the homes in here to be affordable. And parking is typically below grade or in the podium on these, so it's kind of wrapped. You don't experience parking on the street, but it's kind of a large parking garage that you drive into. And you might be familiar with some of these types of buildings. There's one actually not far from here. They're sort of scattered around the kind of Cal Ave area and the University Ave area. You might be familiar with these. Here's some images of what these look like. The one on the right in this image is actually on the project site. This is the one that's on Park Boulevard. And then here, oh, sorry, El Camino Real. Everybody knew that right off the bat. And then the one on the left is also a sort of a local example. The one in the middle, I believe, is from Europe. So just some examples of what that looks like. And then the third building typology is called a type 3, also multifamily residential. This one tends to be rental, so you don't tend to see a lot of for sale product. That makes it much more affordable to a broader range of people because you don't have to pay a down payment in order to rent a unit. This is an 85-foot height limit. It ranges. You tend to see these more in the 75-foot height limit. Again, you have an option for ground floor retail in this type of space, at least 15% affordable, and again, you get the parking in the podium or below grade, sort of consolidated parking situation. So this is what that looks like. This is an example on the left with a Whole Foods in the ground floor, and on the right you can see those are townhomes on the ground floor, and there's kind of a big setback, and then the units above with the kind of generous balconies. So with that, I will hand it over to Sujata, our economic consultant.
Good evening. Okay, so I know that some of you may have seen these slides before from November, but so I'm going to go through them very quickly because this is really just a refresher. So the state requires that cities plan for their housing growth, and the city does have a certified housing element from 2017 that establishes goals for housing production. So this slide is just sort of showing where the city of Palo Alto is as a city in meeting its 2015 to 2023 goals for housing. About halfway through right now and 22% of the way towards meeting its goals. The city's doing better at producing above moderate income housing than the more affordable housing types. I'm sure this is not a surprise to any of you. And in terms of current housing that would be enabled by the zoning as it exists today, I think Kristen touched on this, it would really be more of the townhouse style housing. It would probably be a for sale type of product. However, that could change, particularly now with the new housing incentive program and other types of strategies that you could put into place here in this planning area that could allow you to have higher densities and different kinds of housing products. Now, you know, a lot of this is really contingent on how much redevelopment potential there is, given that most of the site is already occupied, and those opportunity sites have already been discussed as commercial properties for the most part. We've done some analysis of affordable housing potential, and what we know from our work, not just in Palo Alto but in other places, is that it's very difficult to find funding sources for housing that is below market rate. Typically, right now, the construction costs are about $800,000 per unit for an affordable unit, and cities typically need to contribute about 20 to 25% of that to make the projects work. So that is often the case, that it's difficult to put together the funding sources. Affordable housing developers have also been telling us, to be able to access the sources of subsidies at the federal, state level, tax credits, it is ideal to have a density that is higher. So about 120 units per acre is one number that's been thrown out there by some housing developers. We can examine that a little bit more closely as we go further along. So it's really just about having enough density on the site to be able to access the tax credits and other types of funding sources to really be able to get the economies of scale that you require in order to be able to put together that funding package. And that, it's also about the competitiveness of most of the funding sources that are available are competitive. So a lot of it is really tied to how competitive you are going to be against other communities in California that are also competing for tax credit funding. So we can get into that a little bit more in our discussion. The city has approved Wilton Court, which will be the first 100% affordable housing unit, very close to our site. And as you may know, the city has a policy right now that for sale product, 15% of the units need to be affordable to moderate income households. And there's also a rental housing impact fee on rental developments that generates funding for what I just mentioned, the local funding requirements or the local funding gap for affordable housing. So there's a commercial linkage fee also. So there are funding sources in place at the local level that can help meet the affordable housing needs, not just at the site, but citywide. That 15% requirement could also, there might be potential to actually exceed that potentially in certain areas or under certain circumstances, particularly if you're going higher density. The office market, I'm sure you are all aware, is really top of the market here in Palo Alto for the entire Bay Area, commanding very high rents for office and R&D. The site right now, there are some properties that are renting office for between $8 to $9 per square foot. So if you think about that in terms of, I think, John kind of addressed this earlier, the attractiveness of redeveloping an existing office, a leased office building into housing. There's some financial feasibility issues there if you're not able to compete with those types of rents that are currently being achieved with those properties when you factor in the construction costs and all the other things that you need to do for a redevelopment project. So that's one of the things we'll be looking at as we do some financial feasibility analysis. What's the likelihood of redevelopment and what would be required in order for you to do something that is more comprehensive?
For a comparison, go ahead.
Just to make apples to apples, your last bullet, office leasing is on a triple net basis, and all the expenses are the tenants. And on the residential, the $5 is before, about 33% of it is taken out for expenses. So to compare the two, you should drop the 5 to 3.5 at best.
And for comparison, what about retail rentals?
Well, retail rents, it really depends on the location. But I think typically for and, Tim may have some figures that he'd want to share too, but what we are seeing for ground floor retail spaces, unless it's a major tenant, it's usually between $3 to $4 per square foot in ground floor retail spaces. That's what we're seeing in the market, and there are some areas where you can get $5 per square foot when it's really a premium retail site. But I think for smaller retail buildings, that's what we're seeing.
Size of the space, location of the space, I agree. To give you a sense, we were, for the Mike's Bike site, we're looking at $3 to $3.50 a foot triple net. Also a factor is how many TI dollars they need to put into their space that is specific to their use, meaning that you dispose of it after the end of their term.
What are TI dollars?
Tenant improvements, I'm sorry, lingo. So if one comes in and needs all kinds of lighting, special lighting, and decorations, a restaurant, the next tenant's not going to use any of it because it's kind of branded. So you throw out the bathroom you would keep, and maybe some of the drains and things you keep, but a lot of it you end up throwing away at the end of their term. That has to be recuperated in the rent schedule, and they typically kind of borrow it from you and pay you back during the term. So, a vanilla space is probably going to be $3.50 to $4 at best in this area. It goes down with the larger spaces because there's fewer and fewer of them. Fry's is in 80,000 square feet. If we were to replace them, we'd probably be looking at $1.50 to $2 at best. And we wouldn't have an 80,000 square foot, we'd probably have 3 or 4 20s.
So that's a good segue to the last slide that I was going to speak to, which is many of us have observed the way that retail is changing, that many big box stores are shutting down. That's not really the future of retail. So we think it would be very difficult to re-tenant exactly that same amount of retail space in a big box format. There are a lot of examples of kind of breaking down those spaces, redeveloping them, and turning them into something a little bit different. I think we'd have to do a little bit of thinking about if you were to try to preserve a larger amount of retail on this site, what would be a feasible type of retail format that would work here. And I think there's also some issues with the internal nature of that Fry's site, relative to El Camino, which has much more visibility for cars and it's easier to get in and out. Those are more desirable characteristics for the typical retailer. They want to be seen, right? So I think a lot of the analysis that we've done so far suggests that the amount of additional retail that could be supported in the site is going to be highly tied to how much additional activity you can get here, and the new residents and the new workers that can really contribute to that. Because you also have existing retail at California Avenue, you have El Camino, you have many other smaller retail centers. So without cannibalizing your existing retail, what could be possible here may be a little bit more neighborhood serving type of retail that's really for the new residents and workers.
So you're going to be helping us figure out what is possible there, right? Is that?
So some of that work has been done in our existing conditions report, and then we'll be delving a little bit more deeply into that as we get into the alternatives and really looking at, if you have this many housing units and this much office, how much retail spending could that potentially support, and giving you a little bit of, what the trade-offs might be.
Thank you. And all of this information is from the existing conditions report, so if you want to go back and look at it and kind of digest a little bit more. Before we break into groups, do we have any questions on any of this content? Well, we'll be talking at each of the table and lots of opportunities to have conversations there. Gail.
Question, in your feasibility study, are you looking at the potential for I don't know if this is the right word, condoization of retail or office spaces?
Well, we still need to develop what the building types and kind of what the types of scenarios are that we'll be testing the feasibility analysis on. But I think, we would be looking at a pro forma analysis that's based on some typical building types or prototypes. So sort of related to the typologies that Kristen shared on the housing. And we could also do, if we're thinking about the possibility of new office in this area, then that could be something that we test as well. If we're looking at the possibility of, maybe more incubator type of spaces, something that's a little different from your traditional office R&D, we could look at something like that.
And just quickly, are you looking at different ownership patterns, like co-ops? Things like that in your feasibility? And that's my last question right now.
We are looking at a more traditional model for what the investment could look like, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't explore some examples of non-traditional building types.
So one comment and one question. I just think you need to take Sarah Wallace Park off it has no relevance to the North Ventura area. It's such a small park. I don't know if you've been there, you can't even throw a ball in it. So it has a bench, a couple people. Yeah, so it's not relevant to the North Ventura area. And then I'm wondering why you went from 30 dwelling units per acre in that analysis and skipped to 85. Why not 40, which is an existing zoning, or 60 or 70? That seems like kind of an odd choice.
Thank you. Those are sort of typical average numbers for those types of buildings. So each of them represents a range, and I think if if there's a different range that you'd like that, we're going to have cards for you to put down. If you'd like that to represent a different range, that we can definitely mark those up and have that conversation.
Sorry, I have a question. So you give a type, right, and associate the units with it. But of course, you can take very tall buildings and put less of them, right? How are we going to be able to relate the types of the units to the site to, just to see basically how many units we are getting with intensity we want, in case we want to mix the types?
Well, you are an architect, correct?
Yes.
I think at this point, what we're trying to get out of the game is a sort of a policy direction, if you will, sort of a sense of ideas around organization of space, organization of circulation, types of density, types of height that we would be interested in. We're not getting into the level of designing everything in a detailed way yet. But if you have ideas about that, certainly please share those during the game.
Okay.
Angela.
So you said that the parking lot at the Cladera site is sort of up in the air. Is it possible to put housing there or not? I'm not sure what's possible there, or what our options are.
Well, we haven't spoken to them at all about this. This is sort of representative of a piece of land on the site that is vacant. So they aren't here to represent themselves, and we haven't talked to them about this yet. So if you're not comfortable putting anything on that site, you don't have to. It's a big piece of land that's vacant currently.
I'd be thrilled to put something on. But why have they not? I mean, is there a reason why they haven't been speaking with us or taking part in this?
I don't think it's like an active.
Yeah, Cloudera?
Yeah, so they're not obviously a part, it was a comment that we heard, they're not a part of the working group. I think we should probably do a little bit more outreach to see sort of their level of engagement. I think at this point, we're just, there's a lot of parking lots in this area, and if we want to look for increased housing opportunities, this is one that we can certainly consider. And it could be part of the plan. Their, short-term, medium-term interests may not be aligned with that, but we're looking for the long view on this. Yeah, I think let's take one more question, then it might be helpful to go to the breakout groups, because we can maybe focus those discussions tailor them to your particular interests.
Well, my question is about when you say affordable units. And I know that there are many different levels of affordable. And I guess you'll be telling us more about that, or I'm just curious about
I can
that.
share with you when in the smaller groups. So the city's policy is very explicit about a mix of between correct me if I'm wrong, I'm gonna probably get this wrong, between 80 and 100% area median income, and between 100 and 120% of area median income, those are the targets for sale product for the inclusionary requirement. But the rental housing impact fee funds housing that goes from 0 to 80% of area median income.
And is it possible to consider something in between that, like something
Yes.
a little higher, but not as high as full market rate?
Yeah, I think that the 15% requirement is what it is, and I think if you wanted to go above that, you could define if you wanted that to be, what we really need is more middle-income housing, and maybe there's a strategy related to that, and it could be something that's a target. I mean, there are lots of different ways for you to address those.
Well, and just to share, do you want to share this? The target?
Yeah, just so the way that the current, if you did market rate housing at different densities in this area, so based on kind of what current sales prices and rents are, a townhouse development, the sales price right now is, I think, something in the range of 1.3 million. So that would be affordable to a household that is earning $260,000. I'm sorry, yeah, and change. So that's about 200 to 250% of AMI, depending on how big your household is. Okay, so that gives you a sense. If you wanted to do rental housing in a medium density project or a higher density project, those rents are, we sort of talked about that $5 per square foot kind of range. That would be affordable to a household that is earning, again, these are new market rate units, right? So they're kind of the top of the market. That would be affordable to a household that's earning $170,000 per year. And that's at, 130% of area median income for a household of 4. So it kind of gives you a sense of how decisions about what product type you're promoting will serve different income groups, but none of these are going to be below market rate unless you do the inclusionary requirement or some sort of a housing impact fee or something that helps to produce those lower income housing types.
And so the higher the percentage of affordability on site, the the relationship there to the number of units that are provided is the
Right.
relationship.
And if you do a condo development that's a little bit higher density than a townhouse development, then 15% of 50 units is a lot more than 15% of 20 units, right? So if you think about the total yield of how many affordable units you could get, if you're assuming 15%, the higher density your project, the more units you're going to
How
be
many
able to
units
get.
per acre is a typical condo development?
Well, the one that we looked at was, 85? But we've seen, the High Street one, that 800 High, is it 800 High? That was about 60 units per acre.
That's deed restricted housing.
The condo development? It's from 2006.
Yeah, Gloria, that's a different one. I think we're talking about 800 or 801. Well, anyways.
I can't remember, but it is a condo project where
Okay,
I think it was
that's
about 3
800.
stories of, I think it's a 3-story building, and I think it was or 4-story building maybe.
Can I just say, I'd like to emphasize how important it is to think about the middle-income houses and the affordability for teachers and nurses to buy into our community because they work here. That's my thought.
Great, thank you for those questions. So we're going to just quickly move through directions here as a group, and then we'll break out. So this is the planning board, and again, the idea is to really cut up the pieces, annotate the pieces, be very creative. What we've suggested is really just a framework, so please be as expressive as you can. Don't tape until the end, as things are likely to move around. But what we'll do is we'll go through and I guess people probably can't see. So the idea, starting at number 1, is to go through and prioritize your main public realm improvements. So I'm going to go through quickly, but then we're going to break out and the facilitators will be able to help. So there are street improvements, intersection improvements, the idea for public open space that could be paved, could have paving, could also have green space, bicycle infrastructure improvements. And again, this looks like a two-way cycle track, but it can be anything, so feel free to write on it what you're thinking. And then some kind of pedestrian path, if you want to sort of limit an area to just being available to pedestrians. Yeah, so great. I'm going to move on just because of time, if that's okay. Next, you might want to think about a theme to kind of guide your land use. So maybe you really care about affordability, you want to maximize housing. Maybe you care about having an innovation district or keeping small businesses, whatever that might be. It can be really useful to have that guide your planning. And again, try not to be constrained by existing zoning, as part of our charge is to think about revising. Next, so once you sort of have that theme, that will help you guide where you want to place the different typologies that we went through. And again, facilitators are there, and Autumn and Sujata are here to help answer questions. And you can include a community use, you can include office, and then as well as retail. You might want to consider compatibility of adjacent uses, proximity to transit. As we've talked about, sort of a mix of uses. Think about this place being active different times of day and night. And then finally, once you've sort of put your different kind of built form ideas in different places, maybe you want to go back and kind of revise where you put the public realm improvements. So maybe it makes more sense to have a bike path or a pedestrian path in another area, or maybe you want to move some of your park pieces. And so sort of once you have organized that, you can then tape down your pieces. And then really important is to understand what were some of the key themes that you sort of discovered through this process. So please take note of those on the board. And I think that's it.
That's it. So let's start here. Doria, will you be 1, and we'll go around the table, do 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
1,
2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
All right, so 1s are going to stay here, 2s are going to go to that table that's kind of closest, and 3s are going to go to the back table. Ready, go.
Great.
We need to all agree, right, on what goes on there?
I think discussion.
Yeah.
Discussion
And consensus, yeah, discussion and consensus as much as you can, but of course there'll be a lot of ideas. I think Leah and I are going out there.
I'll stay here. Want to have a very mixed use, mixed level of housing, mixed levels of housing, mixed cost of housing. We want to have it highly available for bicycles and pedestrians. We want to direct cars to the outer edges, Lambert, El Camino, Oregon. And we want to improve some intersections on El Camino. We want to see plenty of open space. We want to see a place where people can gather, a community gathering place. And we do want to try to retain the Fry's building because of its historic value, and use it perhaps as a community gathering space, and create some outside areas where people can gather and enjoy themselves. Anything else? Yeah.
No, I was just, no, everything's fine.
good about anything else from the
We had different feelings about the preserving, the degree of preservation. We had different feelings about the degree of preservation of the historic buildings. I mean, adaptive reuse is an idea, making sure that you document the history in a variety of ways, using architectural elements to carry some of those themes to other buildings. But I guess the point is that we looked at a variety of ways to do this. So it wasn't a uniform opinion about this. And there was a lot of discussion about the importance of really developing housing capacity, different ownership models, different, types of housing, as was mentioned. But we had a good time doing this.
You
guys brought up too was actually having some type of way of closing down streets for just pedestrian and bike traffic with potentially bollards as a temporary way of getting people used to that space just being used for peds and bikes. So I thought was really great. Great job, group.
Okay, so we had a couple of features of this. I'm going to move this chair so I can get closer. So we kind of put a core Central Park here. As far as connectivity, we did sort of put a pedestrian connection through here. Then we have a car with a separated bike path through here. And then we have a bike path like this. Just because this is a major bicycle crossing, and then down here on Margarita is a major bicycle crossing, and we wanted those people to be able to throughput to park, and then this is slated to be a pedestrian bike connection. So that sort of allows there to be a nice flow of bicycles. The cars, a lot like the other one, we put kind of directed the driveways towards this side. We're thinking the access to this side is through here. These are townhomes. We got a little random, along the driveway is lower thing, higher ones along El Camino. This one has retail underneath. This one has retail and office underneath. I mean, they both could have retail and office underneath because it's a logical place for offices. Then we did a connection across. There's already a bridge there.
Sorry, can you make sure you speak into the mic?
I would keep more high level just the key themes.
Okay.
You can look on there.
There you go.
So, okay, so the key themes are core central office, core central park, office limited in size, retail, especially experiential retail here. We were reusing the Fry's, the historic buildings sort of in that way. And they're both next to Portage. This is our community area. Because experiential retail isn't dying. We thought this might be sort of the heart of the complex where we can maybe draw activities at night. And we want to prioritize planning for school, but we don't know where to put it. So that's one of the reasons we were very adamant about bicycle connection.
Great.
And I think that's everything. Did that represent what we did?
Group 3. You're up.
Whoever's.
I'm gonna speak, I'm not gonna read this, I cannot. So please correct me if I'm gonna say something. We were in quite a bit of disagreement, so therefore I almost need to have a confirmation on everything I'm gonna say, right? So. No, I disagree with that. All right. So, okay, gonna start from the beginning. So we agreed to have and pedestrian connection from the park toward the Caltrain and California Avenue. Now, we were talking about two improvements to the intersections, and that was our first disagreement. Which one would bring more benefit to the neighborhood? So, kind of, right now it's on equal foot between the two. So this would be underpass under the Oregon Expressway. This one would be improvement to the bridge to make this passage wider for pedestrian, so people coming from Coltrane would kind of have a little more comfortable way to connect to the rest of the Park Avenue. Then similarly, we were respecting that bicycle connection, existing bicycle connection to the Stanford Research Park, and extending this thing all the way to Park Boulevard, so it allows them further to connect in either direction along that neighborhoods. We were thinking of, protecting the existing Pepper Avenue and Olive with one-way, no left turn, right? We were choosing the no left turn.
We two options, yeah.
Waldeck, maybe let's go a little higher level on key themes. You don't have to go through every single detail. Just kind of give an overview of your key. Keep going.
Thank you very much for interrupting me. All right, so protecting the streets. Now, as far as the density, we chose to a variety of options. So in this potential site, we were thinking that we could start with the high building on Oregon Expressway side and kind of lower this thing when we are approaching this existing residential neighborhood. As far as I know, nobody suggested actually removing the existing residential, but we didn't talk much about it. Then again, trying to build it up on the other side, starting with the lower building to the back of the residential street, and then building it up closer it gets to the creek. Now we had additional disagreement about how much access to the site we allowed from the Park Avenue. The two sides were, one was saying that basically the connection to the El Camino should be extended almost to the park and then stop there, not to allow connection to the Park Avenue per se. So all the service, the road service will be from El Camino side. The other option was that it would be kind of equally split between the access from El Camino or from Park Avenue and interrupted through the middle by the green space that would separate the two. So there would be no drive-through, but the access would be divided between the two sides. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Great job.
One thing that we did talk also about is just the park in Lambert. If we have all these one-way streets that kind of dead end, Lambert and Park may be impacted. And so what do you do about that? That's a concern.
Everybody else to do this, might as well. If we had a little more time, we were going to have a little bit of kind of feedback from the consultants on what they heard and what some of the trade-offs might be. But I think it seems like in the interest of everybody getting home to their families, we will move on to public comment at this point.
Yes, why don't we just maybe all sit?
While everyone's finding their seats, so the next meeting that we're going to have, next working group meeting, we're going to take these conversations because all the consultants were at all of these tables. So we're going to go away. We're going to talk amongst ourselves and with city to understand what each table was talking about, what were the kind of key trade-offs that came to light, and kind of make sure that we're getting a full understanding of what everybody was interested in at all of the tables. And we will develop that into two alternatives that act as sort of bookends for the project. So we'll come up with 2 alternatives to present back to you, which will explore these different trade-offs and opportunities. And at that time, we're going to ask you guys to give us feedback. So, I mean, as you were playing the game, you saw how things like you start to put houses somewhere, and then how are you going to get to those houses? You need some roads, but you don't want to drive traffic through. So there's all these kind of complex trade-offs that happen when you start to put these elements in place. So we're going to go kind of work through that, grind through it for 2 options, and then we'll bring it back here to get your feedback on those options. And now that you guys have had your opportunity to put your hands on this a little bit and work through some of these trade-offs, you'll be able to kind of see what those are a little bit more intimately and have a little bit better understanding when you're looking at those plans.
Thank you, Kristen. Robin, how many speakers do we have?
We have 3.
Okay, so we have 3 speakers, and we have a 3-minute time limit. So who's our first speaker?
David Adams.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief. I'll send an email in with some comments about the options document. But I did want to mention a few things. As a property owner on Olive, we do like the green space on the railway spur because it provides a buffer between the residences on Olive and the development in the forest site. I did talk to Autumn because I had some sort of concerns about the traffic, options. And if she wants to talk to me, she's got my number. If there's green space, the neighbourhood would sort of prefer it to be accessible to the neighbourhood, not enclosed like a canyon, in the middle of a development and surrounded by townhouses or whatever. And lastly, the creek. I would really like to see a naturalized creek, but I want to give my experience of what happened to that creek on February 1998. That was the occasion when there was the bad flooding. San Francisco Creek overflowed in Crescent Park. There was a resulting lawsuit against the city. So on that night, I was standing on the bridge of Matadero Creek, and the creek did not overflow, but the flappers on the pipes, the drainage pipes going into the creek, closed up, and so the water backed out of the pipes, the drainage pipes, and actually flooded the area. So that was designated on the city website. It says it's a 70 to 80 year. It was a 70 to 80 year flood. In the document, it says the creek can handle a 100-year flood, which I contend is not quite true because the water was backing out of the drains. That was a 70 to 80-year flood back in '98. What with today's extreme weather, that might be a 50 to 60-year flood. So also offering myself, if the creek consultants want to talk to somebody with some experience of what happened on the creek. Thank you.
Karen.
As you can tell, I feel this is a really important area. A few things. One is, again, using SOFA as a basis. Don't be constrained by what is in Title 18. If you think that, I'll just make stuff up here, if you think that the affordable housing requirement should be 35%, suggest that. It would have to go undergo some economic analysis, but just don't be constrained by the city's 15%. If you don't want to have you want creation of the units and not in lieu fees, then say so. Don't be constrained by what the current zoning is. In SOFA 1, we created a whole new housing type. So it's an opportunity to think creatively. In SOFA also, we constrained office size to 5,000 square feet for any given or any individual office tenant. And I think in this area, there's a lot of concern, as I've heard it anyway, about large office development. I think the neighborhood would think very differently about a dentist's office or a doctor's office or any kind of community serving office as opposed to a very large office development. As I understood, and I don't see the consultant now, but as I understood the consultant's comments earlier and what I saw playing out in the groups is you can't just take an historic or cultural resource and decide, oh, we're going to keep these pieces. You can't do that. The Secretary of Interior Standards has requirements on what has to be kept or what doesn't have to be kept, and the council always has the purview to make a statement of overriding considerations, but don't think you're accomplishing the retention of a cultural resource if you keep keep a fourth of the building at some point in time. It's sort of like saying we're going to keep a tree because it's a heritage tree, but we're only going to keep the left-hand side of it. Doesn't work that way. With regards to retail, I hope I'm talking fast enough. With regards to retail, I have often advocated for an economic development professional, and when you have some singular ownership here, and I have great respect for the property owner who has, they have Fry's there, which is one tenant, but there's nothing like a professional economic development person who can say, like, what mix of retail uses and services are going to work together and support each other and the neighborhood. And the other thing is I heard a comment here about one-way streets. Living on a one-way street, I can tell you that there's speedways. So if you're going to have a one-way street, be careful of what you ask for. They're not only speedways, but people are always going the wrong way, always. I can tell you have to cross my street, you have to look both ways because you never know where a car's coming from. Something that might mitigate that is if you had separated bike path and the one-way street was maybe one lane. But if it's a two-way, one-way street, you're just inviting speed. And I don't think that's what the neighborhood's looking for. I think those are my comments. Okay, thank you.
And the last speaker is Lauren Brown.
Hi, Lauren Brown. I am a commercial property owner of 3 parcels in the area, and I also have my construction business that's been located for the last 70 years. I've got a couple comments to make. Is this effort one that you're starting with a blank canvas that you can do anything you want within this area, or are you just trying to put a Band-Aid on the existing uses and kind of fix the existing problems? And I think you really need to identify whether you really have the ability to start kind of fresh and do everything the way you'd really want to if you were starting from scratch. The next thing is that there is going to be a timeline associated with whatever plan is developed, and it may take decades, maybe 50, 60, 70 or more years before, let's say, 85% of whatever is decided is actually implemented. Okay, so I got the sense from going to the Ventura meeting when people were coming up, they have immediate expectations. So I would hope that the city or the consultants would provide a timeline, a realistic timeline of how this might all unfold and how that impacts existing property owners. Next thing is what's the current head count of both residents and business occupants in this district? And then what is the projected head count for both residents and businesses that you want to plan for? Okay, so does the city have a goal that this area needs to have, needs to house 5,000 people or 10,000 people? Then that should be incorporated into your planning efforts, because it makes a difference of whether you're designing 10-story buildings or 2-story buildings. It seems like a high proportion of the survey readers are residents, and most of them don't want the planning effort to really impact their properties. But you have a lot of properties, you have some properties, and I'll just pick on one piece, is the properties that go up Olive Avenue. They go right into the heart of this whole square, geographic shaped square, that if you're planning from scratch, you wouldn't design it the way it's currently laid out. So then how do you solve that problem where you don't want to affect the existing property owners, but you want to have this comprehensive plan? So I think you need to think about that. The last thing is that there are two large parcels, and these are the J. Paul parcel on the corner of Page Mill and Park, and then the Sobrato property, that compose approximately 40% of the land area within this cap. So they're really the elephants in the room. You've got to decide what you're going to do with these. Now, the Sobrato property may be impacted by the historic nature of that Fry's building. If you can't do much with that property, then how are you going to meet all the housing goals that you want? Now, the J. Paul property has got a 225,000 square foot office building with a bunch of surface parking and parking garage, and it was only built about 20 years ago. It probably has a life expectancy of another 50 to 70 years. So if you really want this new plan to sort of go into effect and sooner rather than later, you're going to need to figure out how to incentivize somebody like J. Paul to redevelop that property sooner. And with so much office investment in there, that property is probably worth $400 million with the current rents that he's getting out of there. So you're going to ask this developer to take 225,000 feet at $8 a square foot out of commission for 2 years while he does demolition and site prep and builds up new housing. You're probably going to have to put in triple the density of housing on that site to ever change it from its existing office use. And,
I'm sorry,
okay,
just
I'll stop
the
there.
timer went off a moment ago, so if you wanted to, happy to talk afterwards if you want to discuss more. Yeah. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for sticking with us this evening. We ran a little bit longer than we had hoped, but we had some good conversation in the beginning and hope to continue that between the working group meetings. We'll reach out and have those. But for now, thank you, and we'll see you next time.